abuse.
Step out of the house. Step out of the house.
Whoa. We're just gonna see.
Before the handcuffs, before the courtrooms, before the whispers of child abuse, it all looked perfect. Ruby Franke was the face of a wildly popular YouTube channel called 8 Passengers, which boasted millions of views and a loyal audience that followed her every parenting tip, family vlog, and moral lesson. The Franks, Ruby, Kevin, and their 6 children seemed like the quintessential American family, clean-cut, devoutly Mormon, and tightly knit. But behind the ring lights and chore charts was a slow unraveling that no audience could see until it was far too late. In August 2023, headlines exploded with shocking news. 2 children had escaped from the Utah home of Jodi Hildebrandt, Ruby's close friend and business partner, and showed clear signs of starvation, physical restraint, and emotional trauma. The police were called. What followed was a raid, arrests, and a nation left stunned. Both Ruby and Jodi were charged with multiple counts of child abuse, and in early 2024, they pleaded guilty and were sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The internet turned from admiration to outrage, but one name remained curiously quiet in all the headlines: Kevin Franke, Ruby's husband. Now, Kevin Franke is stepping out of the shadows. In a bombshell civil lawsuit filed in Utah court in mid-2025, Kevin alleges that Jodi Hildebrandt, under the guise of being a licensed mental health counselor, manipulated, controlled, and psychologically tortured his wife and children for years. He claims she used her credentials to isolate Ruby, sow distrust within the family, and ultimately dismantle his marriage and destroy his family. He isn't just seeking damages, he's demanding answers. And what he's alleging could rewrite everything we thought we knew about this case. This is not just a story of abuse, it's a story of manipulation, religious extremism, misplaced trust, and the devastating cost of silence. In this episode, we investigate the lawsuit that could change the entire narrative of the Ruby Franke case. Welcome to Echoes of the Court, where justice isn't just what happens in the verdict, but what lies beneath the surface. If you care about the truth and what it really costs to tell it, subscribe to this channel and stay with us until the end. According to Kevin Franke's civil complaint, the seeds of destruction were planted the moment Ruby began therapy sessions with Jodi Hildebrandt, founder of a counseling organization known as Connections Classroom. On the surface, Jodi marketed herself as a therapist who combined clinical psychology with faith-based principles. But what Kevin describes was far from healing, it was indoctrination. At the heart of Jodi's method was a binary worldview. People were either living in truth or in distortion. Ruby, already overwhelmed by the pressures of motherhood and public life, was told she was in distortion, not righteous enough, not strict enough, not pure enough. And the solution, according to Jodi, was obedience. Absolute obedience. Jodi's brand of therapy didn't stop at the office door. She began inserting herself into the Franke household, not just as a counselor, but as a spiritual authority, dictating parenting strategies, moral decisions, and even who Ruby should trust. Over time, Kevin alleges, Jodi convinced Ruby that he was a danger to their children, emotionally abusive, spiritually corrupt. Their marital problems, once private, became weaponized. Kevin says Ruby began keeping secrets from him, isolating him from the children, and making major family decisions based solely on Jodi's advice. Eventually, Ruby moved out, taking the kids with her. Not long after, she cut off all contact. What Kevin didn't realize was that Jodi's grip on Ruby had intensified so much so that his children were now under her supervision. And what she considered discipline crossed every ethical and legal boundary. In court records, Kevin paints a chilling portrait. A once unified family dismantled piece by piece under the influence of a woman who called herself a therapist, but acted more like a cult leader. Her doctrine of living in truth became a justification for surveillance, punishment, and ultimately, dehumanization. Jodi's influence was not just mental, it was medical. Kevin alleges that she advised against necessary treatment for one of the children and pressured Ruby to ignore professional advice in favor of spiritual correction. In doing so, Kevin believes Jodi crossed a legal line not just as a manipulator, but as a practitioner of dangerous pseudoscience. And still, no one around them, neighbors, church members, Even fans seemed to notice what was happening behind closed doors. Was it denial? Blind faith? Or was Jodi just that good at hiding in plain sight? We're only beginning to understand the full scope of her influence. It was the 30th of August, 2023, when the carefully constructed facade of the Franke-Hildebrandt alliance finally shattered, and it didn't happen in court or online. It happened in a quiet Utah neighborhood, when an one-year-old boy escaped from Jodi Hildebrandt's home, emaciated, his ankles bound with duct tape, wounds covering his body. He ran through the streets to a neighbor's house and begged for food and water. The neighbor, shocked by the boy's condition, immediately called 911. When police arrived at the property, they found not only the one-year-old but also another child in similar condition. Investigators later reported that both children had been subjected to prolonged starvation, confinement, and physical restraint. The house itself showed signs of calculated neglect: windows blacked out, emergency escape routes blocked, and food locked away. The arrest of Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt followed within hours. The internet exploded. News outlets that once praised 8 passengers now dissected every video with forensic scrutiny. How had no one seen this coming? But for Kevin Franke, it wasn't just a shocking revelation, it was confirmation of his worst fears. By then, Kevin had been estranged from Ruby and the children for months. He had tried to reconnect, to gain visitation, to understand what was happening. But in his lawsuit, he claims Jodi systematically blocked all access, labeling him as toxic and unfit. Ruby, under Jodi's influence, filed restraining orders and refused any form of family mediation. And now, 2 of his children had barely escaped what investigators called a house of torture. The headlines focused on Ruby's betrayal, Jodi's manipulation, and the horror inflicted on the kids, but Kevin's story was largely ignored. He hadn't been there when the arrests were made, nor when the videos were published. But according to him, that's because he had been pushed out deliberately, with Jodi orchestrating his erasure from the family unit. In his lawsuit, Kevin asserts that this wasn't just negligence, it was orchestration, that Jodi used her credentials and authority to create a false narrative, one where Ruby and the kids needed to be saved from him, when in fact, it was he who had been trying to save them all along. The lawsuit calls it emotional sabotage, but the emotional wreckage, broken trust, isolated children, a destroyed marriage goes far beyond legal terminology. And one haunting question lingers. If that little boy hadn't escaped, would anyone have ever known? To truly understand how Jodi Hildebrandt was able to wield such extreme power over Ruby Franke and her children, we have to examine the ideological structure behind her counseling program, Connections Classroom. At first glance, it was branded as a values-based mental health service, grounded in truth, accountability, and emotional honesty. But as Kevin Franke's lawsuit lays bare, beneath the surface was a disturbing web of control, submission, and spiritual absolutism. According to former clients and public records, Jodi's therapeutic approach centered around a rigid moral binary. You were either living in truth or distortion. This black-and-white philosophy offered no room for nuance, disagreement, or emotional complexity. Those who questioned Jodi's teachings were labeled as being addicted to distortion or spiritually unwell. In Kevin's case, Jodi allegedly manipulated Ruby into believing that her own husband was not just misguided but evil. In court documents, Kevin describes Jodi's sessions as increasingly resembling cult indoctrination. She reportedly required clients to cut off outside influences, abandon worldly therapists, and place their trust solely in her doctrine. Ruby, once a fiercely independent mother and YouTube entrepreneur, gradually became a mouthpiece for Jodi's ideology, echoing her beliefs in videos and conversations, even as her parenting became more extreme. And Jodi didn't stop at mental control. Kevin's complaint accuses her of undermining medical decisions, encouraging Ruby to reject professional interventions, and replacing science with spiritual correction. This is where the line between therapy and cult leadership becomes dangerously thin. What makes this even more insidious is that Jodi operated legally for years with a state license, a professional website, and public appearances. She wasn't some fringe figure in the woods. She was a licensed counselor, promoted in conservative religious circles, who use that credibility to build psychological dependency. Kevin isn't the only one raising red flags. Since the arrest, former clients and whistleblowers have come forward, echoing similar experiences of coercion, judgment, and emotional manipulation. One parent described feeling exorcised by Jodi. Another said their teen was told they were possessed by distortion for having doubts. In hindsight, the signs were there. The overly harsh parenting tactics, the isolation from extended family, the obsession with moral purity. But under the cloak of therapy, Jodi's teachings were protected, legitimized, and even monetized. Kevin's lawsuit isn't just a personal battle. It's a direct attack on the systemic failures that allowed someone like Jodi to hide behind credentials while inflicting long-term psychological harm. And now, that mask is cracking. As Kevin Franke steps into the courtroom not as a defendant, not as a bystander, but as a plaintiff, his lawsuit against Jodi Hildebrandt becomes more than a personal crusade. It becomes a public indictment of the systems and structures that enabled her. And his central message is chilling in its clarity. This never should have happened. Kevin's legal team argues that Jodi violated both ethical and legal boundaries in her role as a licensed mental health professional. Not only did she engage in emotional manipulation, they say she used her authority to interfere in a marriage, break apart a family, and cause lasting trauma to multiple children. In any other field, this might be called malpractice. In this case, Kevin calls it destruction disguised as therapy. But here's where it gets more complicated. The state of Utah had, for years, licensed Jodi Hildebrandt, despite multiple red flags in her professional history. Kevin's team points to earlier disciplinary actions, including a 2012 incident in which Jodi's license was temporarily suspended for confidentiality violations. Yet even after that, she was allowed to practice and build her connections empire unchecked. Now, Kevin is asking the court not only to hold Jodi accountable, but to expose a system that failed to protect families like his. His lawsuit seeks financial damages, but also something deeper: validation, vindication, and a public acknowledgement of how far this went beyond one therapist and one mother. In courtroom filings, Kevin lays bare what his family endured. Years of separation from his children under false pretenses, being painted as a threat without legal cause, watching his children suffer abuse he had no power to stop, and being dismissed by the very institutions he turned to for help. The case also threatens to reopen wounds for the wider LDS community, where Jodi's teachings found fertile ground. Was this simply one rogue counselor? Or is there a deeper cultural vulnerability that allowed her philosophy to gain such traction? As the court weighs evidence, hears testimony, and prepares for a possible trial, the spotlight returns to a question that haunted the original abuse case. How many people looked away, and why? Kevin Franke is demanding answers not just for himself, but for every parent who trusted a system that told them they were safe. The dust hasn't settled, but the wreckage is undeniable. For Kevin Franke, the aftermath of his family's collapse isn't just emotional, it's generational. His lawsuit details the long shadow of trauma that now haunts his children: trust issues, mental health struggles, fear of authority figures, and a profound sense of betrayal by the very adults meant to protect them. These aren't just symptoms of abuse, they're the scars of systematic psychological warfare, disguised as moral guidance. And while Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt are both serving prison time, Kevin's legal battle suggests that accountability doesn't end with incarceration. It extends to institutions that enabled the abuse, church leaders who stayed silent, and professional boards that failed to act despite past warnings. The public fallout has been equally complex. Fans of the 8 Passengers channel, once loyal and uncritical, now wrestle with complicity. How did millions watch Ruby enforce disturbing punishments on camera and call it parenting? Why did so many commenters cheer her on while Kevin was being erased? Some critics argue that family vlogging itself must be scrutinized, as children's lives are mined for content and profit. Others point fingers at the overlap between religious extremism and psychological control. But Kevin's message is sharper. This was never about YouTube. It was about manipulation, weaponized through legitimacy by a counselor, a mother, and a belief system that punished dissent. Today, Kevin Franke is slowly rebuilding his relationship with his surviving children. According to recent statements, some of them are in therapy, real therapy, and living apart from both their mother and Jodi's influence. But healing is slow. Trust, he admits, is earned back in inches. The legal process will continue. Depositions, expert testimony, motions, perhaps even a public trial. And while financial compensation is on the table, Kevin's focus remains clear: exposure, accountability, and reform. He wants state regulators to re-examine how mental health licenses are granted and monitored. He wants religious institutions to reflect on how spiritual obedience can mask authoritarian abuse. And he wants the world to look closer not at the influencers on screen, but at the power structures behind them. Because the real danger, he says, isn't one counselor or one mother. It's a culture that looks away until it's too late. As Kevin Franke's lawsuit moves closer to a potential trial, the world waits not for a sensational headline, but for something deeper: a reckoning. This is not a criminal case where guilt or innocence ends with a sentence. Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt are already behind bars. But Kevin's civil suit raises harder questions, questions that don't have clear-cut verdicts. Questions like, can psychological abuse be prosecuted when it's masked as therapy? Can a system truly offer justice when it failed so thoroughly to prevent the harm in the first place? And perhaps most painfully, can a father ever fully reclaim the love and trust of children who were taught to fear him? In the court of public opinion, the narrative is shifting. Once dismissed as the absent father, Kevin Franke is now being seen in a new light, as a man who fought for his family when no one else would. But for him, this isn't redemption, it's responsibility. He's not just suing for damages, he's suing to prevent the next family from falling into the same trap. Still, not everyone is ready to believe him. Some critics point out that Kevin was once part of the same parenting framework, that he helped build the brand that glorified discipline and control. Others question whether his lawsuit is driven by a desire for vindication or vengeance. But that's exactly what makes this case so complicated and so human. There are no heroes here, only survivors. And the line between victim and enabler, between protector and bystander, is razor thin. Ultimately, a judge or jury may decide if Jodi Hildebrandt owes Kevin Franke damages. But the bigger verdict will be written by what happens after. Whether laws are changed, licenses revoked, families warned, and watchdogs finally held to account. For now, Kevin stands alone in a courtroom, holding not just a lawsuit but a mirror for the therapy industry, for faith-based parenting, for YouTube culture, for us, because the real question isn't whether justice will be served. It's whether we'll recognize it when it finally arrives. This is Echoes of the Court. If you found this story important, thought-provoking, or infuriating, subscribe and share it. The only way we stop this from happening again is to stop pretending it can't.